lovely to have you here today, Poppy. I was really impressed when I saw you doing a talk one time about your approach to, I know that you've done a career change yourself and you've moved into, I'm going to broaden it out and just say the death sector, but you do run your own funeral business. And I just remember your approach to that being really empathetic, and certainly experiences of other friends being that there does seem to be this sort of change needed for the funeral sector. So I was just really fascinated and really wanted you to come along today, because I think of all of the people that can talk about moving into this sector as a career change, you're probably best placed to kind of advise on that. So can we start with you giving a bit of an introduction to yourself, and what was it that made you move into this sector?
Yeah, definitely. So nice to be here. Thanks for having me. So I am Poppy, and I set up Poppy's 11 years ago. And we are a modern funeral directors. And when we use that word modern, it's very difficult to find the right word to use. We want to let people know that we're kind of bringing a fresh approach to this sector. But, you know, we're not walking around in like minimalist white spacesuits. Really, what we're doing is it's really the old fashioned approach, which is treating our living clients and their dead people like the kind of precious members of our community that they are. So really bringing back that sort of more old fashioned way of caring for the dead. Poppy's launched in 2012. I'll talk about it a bit later, but I didn't have any experience in the sector at all, so I am a good person to talk to about career changes. We started off by offering a very kind of specific, very simple service, but because I had no experience, so that was my sort of thinking, was like, okay, I'm going to start with something that I can totally control and totally envision. But with this very, very, as you say, empathetic human culture. And then from the very beginning, obviously, people would call and say, I really like the look of you, but I don't want that. Can you help me with this? And it was actually a really nice way to grow, because rather than saying we can do anything, you know, requests would come in and we say, yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that. And we, you know, there was almost nothing that we said no to. The only thing that we are a bit wary of is, like if people want a lot of sort of like chemical process, so we take a pretty natural approach to the body. So we mostly don't embalm, and we could talk a little bit later about embalming and what that is and why someone might have that. But the three principles underpinning Poppy's are that you are unique, and your funeral should be unique, and your family and your friends and your community will have a bunch of unique needs, and we want to know what those are so that we can get on with making that happen. And so that means really different things to different people. So for some people, that's about cost. You know, it's like, I'm petrified of the expense. I need to do this as affordably as possible. So how can we support you to do this thing meaningfully in a way that, you know, means that you don't get into debt? For someone else, that might be about speed. You know, so it might be, you know, someone's about to fly off to Sydney, or she can't fly in for 4 weeks. And that's the priority. The priority is those people coming, or those people being here. Okay, so let's set the whole thing to that timeline. Or for someone else, it might be about tradition. So it might be, you know, we are very traditional people, or we are orthodox in one specific faith. Then that will set the tone. Or it might be, you know, there are a lot of small children coming. Perhaps a parent has died, perhaps a child has died. You know, well, let's design this whole thing around those kids. Let's make sure that their needs are met, rather than, you know, should they come to something that's been designed for an adult, let's just design it for them. So that's the first principle, is that you're unique and you deserve a unique experience. The second principle is that, I mean, it sounds so obvious, but it's not very common in the sector, you know, that we'll really be by your side every step of the way. So back to this idea that, like, you are precious, you matter, the dead person is precious, they matter. This moment in your life will shape your outcomes and your future. You know, we don't talk about that enough. We don't think about that enough, that we will all die, we will all grieve, and the way we are handled and held or not during that time can really help us build that relationship with that dead person, you know, beyond their death, or it can really traumatize us and cause additional harm. And so that's about, you know, that we take our responsibility to you and your emotional needs really seriously, and we want to get it right. And the third principle is about people and planet. So, you know, in a sector that's pretty backwards in its approach to culture, organizational culture, and also impact on the planet, making sure that we run ourselves. You know, we talk a lot about like being a business that's worth growing, we're trying to grow, but we don't just want to grow for the sake of growth. So can we make sure that we resource our people to resource our clients, you know, that particularly because of the emotional nature of our work, you know, sometimes lots of it's actually surprisingly uplifting and fun and inspiring, but you know, sometimes you do have a tough time, and making sure that the people in our team feel really cared for and resourced. And similarly, the planet. So in a sector that embalms about 40% of people unnecessarily, we embalm less than 1%. And embalming uses this toxic mixture of formaldehyde and a few other chemicals to replace lots of fluids in the body. It's not necessary. You know, funeral directors commonly line their coffins with plastic. People are often going into coffins in body bags. You know, all these things people don't really know about, and they're completely grim and totally unnecessary. Like stripping away all of that stuff to try and get people in the most natural condition possible, and making sure that, you know, most people, whether you think of yourself as someone who cares hugely about the environment or not, most of us want our lasting legacy to be positive, and making sure that that legacy planet-wise is positive too. And we're now 11 years old. We look after about 300 families a year across Greater London. We're based in Tooting, is our sort of HQ, but we cover a very wide coverage area, and we have looked after people in, you know, the Isle of Wight and Somerset and Norfolk when they feel so strongly about getting the best care, they're willing to sort of travel for our services. It doesn't make huge sense because it's quite a logistical business. And what we're doing at the moment is growing across Greater London. So we're hoping to open a new site near Richmond in the next 6 months. And our ambition will be to be geographically located around the whole of Greater London, because however powerful a reputation, there is a sort of geographical barrier for people. You know, I think you look great, but you know, I can't cope with my mum's body being the other side of the river is a sort of classic one. So we've sort of figured out we need to be in more physical places to be accessible to a much wider group of people. But the big mission is to change our sector to become the kind of human, gentle, thoughtful service that it used to be and could be, through showing.
I mean, and your business and your ethos and everything about you sounds quite unique.
Yeah.
What would you say? I mean, I guess there's sort of two questions that I want to ask. So one is, if someone was interested in moving into this sector and they're sort of thinking, maybe they've had a bad experience, or maybe they think that they've got the sorts of skills that would lend themselves to working in this sort of a sector, what, from your perspective, are the sort of skills and qualities that you think, you know, make someone thrive, or would make them the sort of person that would really lend themselves to working well in this sector?
And that's a good question, because I think I'll start with the things that I think the sector needs, but I think it's good to have a reality check about what some of the sector looks like right now and how much that might be appreciated. Because
I think there's a difference between what you're talking about and I think what the majority of the sector, and I think if people go in thinking that they're going to do what Poppy expects, they might have a hard reality check. So
so I think you can bunch up. There's the traditional sector, which is made up of a few massive corporates and quite a lot of independents, although those independents might have like 30 shops. And then there's funeral directors like us, and there aren't a lot of funeral directors like us, but that number is growing. So there are more and more people who are mostly not coming from the sector, they're coming from other worlds, and they're drawn. And you know, those funeral directors are often found on a website called the Good Funeral Guide. So that would be a place I would go. And I can pop a link in the chat if that's helpful. And I know we're going to get onto this, but also our community is populated with other roles. So death doulas, soul midwives, celebrants, you know, lots of kind of hospice nurses. You know, I'd say there is a wide group that might not all be funeral directors, but they are coming at this work with the same approach, which is, again, that this matters, basically, that you matter and this experience matters, and that there should be a holistic approach. So that's the first thing I'd say is, you know, maybe it's about, if you're wanting to kind of join this more progressive, positive movement, it might be working at funeral director, or it might be working around them. In terms of the qualities that I think people need to do this work well, I think it comes down to kind of two main skills or approaches. The first one is obviously compassion. So are you someone that is moved by the plight of other people? You know, do other people, when another person is vulnerable and in need, are you generally inclined to want to help, or do you, you know, run for the mountains. Obviously, if you run for the mountains, you won't be watching this video. So I think that's the first thing, because the thrill of the work, that, you know, is kind of an adrenaline ride at times. You know, you're advocating for people. You're often kind of tussling with a coroner or a police officer or a doctor to kind of get some paperwork in time, or you're trying to pull something off. You know, we're hiring a double-decker bus to take someone down the A3 to some natural burial ground, you know, and there can be quite a lot of, like, computer says no, and you're kind of ducking and diving on their behalf. So that is thrilling when you really care about this person's experience. So I think that's about compassion. But I think crucially, particularly this work that we do, and it would be true for soul midwives and death doulas too, and anyone working in hospice, is that kind of practical approach. So, you know, we are not therapists. We don't spend most of our time emoting with our clients. We spend most of our time creating space for them to be emotional, and then we go off and make that stuff happen. We talk about practical compassion at Poppy, so we're looking for that in people. It's that you care and you want to do something about it, and then you want to, like, roll up your sleeves and get stuff done. And that would definitely, you know, if you were a hospice nurse, that would obviously be true too. Sometimes I meet people who want to get into this work, so I think there's something about, which would be true of any work where you're kind of supporting people who are vulnerable. You know, it's just about making sure you're meeting their needs, not yours, too much. I mean, obviously you need to meet both of your needs in order to thrive in any job, but I've met the occasional person where I felt like you're going through something, or you're recently bereaved, and what you really need to do is go off and look after yourself. Which doesn't mean you couldn't come back and be really useful in the sector later, but, you know, so many of us, I think, start asking these questions about, maybe there's more, maybe I'm looking for more purpose, you know, I want to help people who've been in the position I'm in, and it's just about that quick check. They're like, are you in that robust place right now in your life where you could do this, you know, because we, you know, this week we're looking after a young boy who's died by suicide, you know, and transporting his body from one part of the UK to another. And, you know, I don't want to overplay it. Like, I think when you're surrounded by the right team, when you look after yourself well, you know, I don't feel sunk by these things. I feel really motivated to help that family do right by their boy. But it's just that check of, you know, you are supporting other people who are vulnerable. You have to be in a somewhat robust place in your life to do it well.
That's really, really good advice. And what would you say would be a more, I guess, realistic experience if someone wasn't coming to Poppy's?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's some really good people out there. Yeah, I don't really respect the organisations. I don't respect the leadership, but there are some really good people in the sector. You know, whether that be in the working in the crematoria. I mean, remembering there's crematoria and there's cemeteries and there's natural burial grounds, and there's funeral directors. I think that, you know, the big, I won't name names, but, like, you know, the big chains would appreciate those skills. I think the challenge is you then can be put under pressure. So it's that thing of, like, I've come here to give this, and you're telling me that. So a good example is the way that most funeral directors work is they have a shop where the living go to organise funerals with a funeral arranger, who mostly is the person in the shop, and they're often on their own, which I think isn't great. And then you have a kind of hub mortuary where the dead are cared for, and it might be, you know, 5 miles away, and there might be, like, hundreds of dead people in body bags, you know, being collected. And so, and that'll be staffed by mortuary workers who, again, might not be bad people, but their work isn't, you know, it's not really validated or respected by the organisation. So what a really good funeral arranger will start to feel is like, hang on, you know, to do a really good job supporting the family, I kind of need to know the dead person too. Like, I at least need to see them. You know, the questions I'm getting asked are like, does my dad still have that scarf I left with him? Or, like, how does my dad look? And you're calling some, you know, guy who may or may not give a toss about his job, you know, who's communicating, you know, what people start to feel is like, like, I can't do a good job for these people if I'm cut off from the dead. And similarly, on the day of the funeral, the person who shows up will be the funeral director, who you will never have met before, some guy in, like, a top hat who will be doing, like, 7 funerals that day. So again, a good funeral arranger will start to feel like, I've supported them the whole way through. I want to be there on the day. They know me, like, I know them. I know what they need. So I think that's what I think it'd be, you know, like anyone, I think it's good to go and work for people who aren't great at what they do, because that helps you
improve.
Yeah, you know, 6 to 12 months at, you know, a business that isn't miserable but is, you know, not perfect, will help tone your sense of where you might fit in. I don't think it's the worst thing, but I think you probably will start to feel those things grate and grind if you are really committed to your clients.
Yeah, fantastic overview, and thank you for that. We've got a few people who are interested in moving into this sector. What is the starting point? So what are the routes in? What are the kind of, if you could talk a bit about training, qualifications, things like that, that would be really helpful.
So absolutely anyone can become a funeral director. In fact, I set up a funeral directors and I had no qualifications at all. So that's good news and bad news to people. For someone like me who's a bit of a hustler, I'm like thrilled about that. For other people who like the kind of feeling of being held and supported as they transfer from one environment to another, that might feel pretty terrifying. And there are a bunch of qualifications you can do, but they mostly are run by the big players. You know, I wouldn't want someone in my team going and being trained that way, because I think you're going to be, even tiny things that I think matter hugely, like in the funeral sector, as soon as you die, you stop being called John and you start being called the deceased, which I think is hugely problematic. So you lose your gender, you lose your identity, you lose your personhood. And I don't know why, I always say, a bit of a joke, but it's like, if my kids' primary school teachers can remember the names of like 30 people in their class, we can remember the names of 30 people in the mortuary. You know, we don't need to generalize. And as soon as you're in that world, that's, you know, it will just be your bread and butter. And so I'm probably a bit snobby. I'd stay clear of those things. There's a company called, and again, I can send a link. They are called, I think they're called Heart and Soul Funerals. And they are in Devon, which is obviously not round the corner. And they do some training. You know, you go there for a week, and it's kind of a retreat. Have a look at Heart and Soul Funerals. But the thing I do first, actually, is I would try and go and spend a few hours behind the scenes with the funeral director. That will really sharpen up your sense of whether you want to do this or not, particularly in the mortuary. Not that, again, when we are hiring people at Poppy's, mostly we find, so we only have one person out of 15 who comes from the sector. Everyone else comes from different walks of life. And almost everyone is really keen to support the living and a bit nervous about the dead, because we're just not used to in our culture spending time with the dead. And I like it that way, you know, because what I feel confident about is when we get you in the mortuary and you see what we do, you'll become deeply passionate immediately. And now at Poppy's, you know, getting to spend a couple of hours in the mortuary is like everybody's favorite thing to do, because it's calm and it's peaceful and it's really fulfilling work. But I don't want someone who's like really excited about like covering people in mortuary makeup, or, you know, frilly little outfits for dead people. Like that for me would be like a big red flag. So I think spending some time in the mortuary it doesn't mean you'll love what you see, but it's like, do I think, you know. So when I was getting into it, the thing I did is I went and spent a month with another funeral director, and they just wanted me to be like in the front office, and I had no, you know, I've spent time in an office, I don't need that. I wanted to be in the mortuary, and I ended up spending a month in the mortuary, and I saw some good stuff and I saw lots of really bad stuff, and that really like fueled the fire. You know, it's like, I could do better than this, you know, and I don't even have any experience, because it's remembering it's caring work, you know. So it's like, it's about caring. It's no different. That's why I think women or people with those feminine qualities that can be so well suited is it's just treating human beings like they matter.
So, I mean, from the sounds of it, it sounds as though, don't get me wrong, I don't want to say it's easy work, but there isn't necessarily this high barrier, right? You know, like doctors, you're going to have to train for 8 years. So it doesn't sound as though there's a high barrier of entry of getting in. And on that basis, you could say potentially quite easy to get in, right? You don't have to have all these like years of qualifications. You don't have to pay to go off and do a master's. So you remove those barriers. So then I guess the next question that's related to it is, I guess, how easy is it? Because again, if we look at our community, the ages are probably 45 to about 75. Could you talk a little bit about, you know, what barriers there are potentially around age, if any?
So maybe a helpful way to start is to think about different roles. So there are, I'd say the roles kind of probably fall into 3-ish categories. So there are the people who are receiving the grieving people. So whether you are on the phone or in the you know, in other funeral days, in the shop or on site at Poppy's, you are the person who, and we call that a client support advisor, which is slightly different to a funeral arranger, but that's the sort of territory we're talking about. You are the people who are the grieving people are landing in the arms of. You know, they are showing up, whether on the phone or in person. They are mostly terrified because most people haven't organised a funeral before. I think, you know, average age of first experience is like 50s, sometimes 60s. Max, you organise like 2 or 3 in your lifetime. No one feels confident or an expert at doing this. So you're receiving people who mostly feel quite confident in their lives. They may be exhausted because they may have been caring for someone in the run up to the death. They are grieving, which means they're mental and physical. There'll be lots of, you know, difficult things going on in their bodies that make them extra vulnerable. And they probably have no idea what they want. And so this is a role, this is a really important role, right? Like this is kind of listening. This is compassion. This is starting to ask relevant questions that help them figure out what it is they want. And so you don't need physical strength for that role. You need maturity, and some young people have it, but mostly older people have it. You need that kind of anchored groundedness. They need to feel like you're not, you know, they're spinning off. They need to feel like you're not spinning off. You can handle this, you can hold them. And you need to be, you know, good with detail, because you don't want to ask them twice. You know, they've told you something important, you need to have heard it, and it needs to be kind of written down. And then you'll start making some plans for the funeral. So I don't see why that role, I would imagine that your community would be perfectly suited to that role. You know, young people really struggle to bring the gravitas to that role that's needed. The next role could absolutely work is the funeral director. So sometimes that's the same person, but often it's not. And the funeral director is the person who's there on the day, kind of holding it together. You don't necessarily need, again, to be, you're not necessarily carrying the coffin. Sometimes you might be, but that role again is about being the face of the holding things together on the day. So you're making sure the hearse arrives on time, you are greeting the family, you are making sure the congregation get in on time, you're making sure the thing starts on time, you're making sure the vicar or the celebrant or the rabbi have everything they need. You're endlessly making eye contact with the kind of your clients to, is anything happening, is, you know, any last details, anything, blah, blah, blah. You're staying in the room to make sure the whole thing runs smoothly. If something goes wrong, you've got to fix it, you know, so if the music goes wrong, or if someone faints, or, you know, that's kind of on you to start figuring that out. And so that could be appropriate depending on how people feel about that. You know, that is more of an events role. So there's a bit of adrenaline in that role. And then the last part is the kind of practical caring for the dead side. So that is physical work, you know, going to someone's house and lifting someone who's died onto a stretcher and carrying them out of the house and putting them in the back of a vehicle, bringing them back for us to Poppy's, dressing them, cleaning them, getting them into their coffin. That is, you know, you need physical strength, you need to be in good physical shape. However, that has led in a sector to mortuary work basically being dominated by like big burly men. And it's slightly become like, this sounds sensational, I've just written a paper on this, but, you know, at worst it can feel a bit like sort of waste management. You know, it's like you're lugging people around and everybody needs to be in the right box, you know, and what's really missing in mortuary work, I'd say as a whole, is that kind of care. And so what we do at Poppy's is we make sure, I mean, we do have some excellent men who are very strong, we have some excellent women who are very strong, but we also have some excellent people who absolutely couldn't do all of the physical stuff by themselves, but they're brilliant at making sure the dead person is in the condition they need to be. So it's to say, you know, some of the standard jobs you'd apply for at a funeral director if you wanted to get into mortuary work would be a bit like, you know, you're driving around in a van collecting lots and lots of dead people, and it's very physical and you'd need to be physically strong. If you approached a more thoughtful funeral director, or if you were working in hospice care or a death doula or a soul midwife, you know, you would be doing that physical practical work, but, you know, the priority wouldn't be considered to be like heavy lifting. You know, other people can help with that.
Yeah, fascinating. So then my last question was just then, you've mentioned about things like death doula, soul midwife. Could you just talk a little bit about some of the other kind of related aspects to the industry?
So death doula and soul midwife are two names for a very similar role. So if you do some research, what you'll probably find is, different organizations are training, and they might be slightly different qualities. So I know there's a lovely woman called Felicity Warner, who I think came up with the phrase soul midwife, and she trains people, I think, in Dorset. And there is more of a kind of spiritual bent to that role as she prepares people. There's another amazing woman called Hermione Elliott, who is also spiritual, but she comes from a nursing background, and she trains death doulas, and her training, as I understand it, is slightly more practical. So people, I think, doing their research would quite quickly figure out, that there is like a small difference, and you figure out which camp you're probably in. So these are people who, it's a somewhat new, it's obviously an ancient idea that women midwives would be working in the community to support people as their life comes to an end, to make sure that that experience is both physically and practically, but also spiritually meaningful for them and their family. But there's been this kind of take up of that role. So these are people who are employed to support the family and support the dying person in the weeks and months and days as death approaches. And so they might be doing really practical things like making lasagna or organizing a food rota in the community. They might be facilitating conversations within the family to make sure that people are getting the chance to say the things they need to say. They might be the person that the dying person can be really open with in the knowledge that sometimes within the family, like, for example, the kids might struggle to hear. There's a phenomenon that you'll know well if you've ever spent time in a hospice of, because we're not great at death, and because we don't, we're not given much of a training through our lives in recognizing it as part of our life. The hospice might be telling the family that the person is dying, but the kids kind of like struggle to hear it. And that can be kind of lonely for the person who knows they're dying, because they maybe want to have a conversation. So again, a death doula or a soul midwife would be good at
those conversations
and being there. I don't know, it would be interesting to call those organizations. I don't know how many people are employing those people. So I don't know that it is like a really reliable salary right now. What I know, that the kind of death doulas and soul midwives I know have trained, and it is part of a kind of much broader life, a kind of portfolio life. And they're mostly, I think, doing it more for the experience than for the salary. A celebrant is a slightly different thing. So a celebrant is a sort of non-religious minister who will lead the funeral in place of a vicar or a rabbi or a priest if you don't have a religion, but you want someone to hold the space and anchor the ceremony, and you might also want some spirituality that reflects your specific beliefs and needs. And that is, I think, is a slightly more reliable living. So celebrants are paid somewhere between sort of £250 and £300 for a funeral. You're not going to be doing sort of 5 funerals a week, because they are, to do it well, it's going to take up your emotional energy and time. But a celebrant is employed. Sometimes a family will find a celebrant first and then find a funeral director, and sometimes a family will come to us and we might recommend some celebrants. But you are meeting with the family to learn about the person who's died, to plan the funeral. It's a much more kind of ritualistic role, which is right for those kinds of people. So you're then leading the ceremony on the day. And
so then, last question, given that you're sort of talking a little bit about reliable salaries and what people could potentially earn, what about in the funeral business? If someone wants to come in, what might be a kind of a range that you would suggest could be realistic for people?
It's not highly paying, like lots of caring work. It's just not a lot of cash. But so I think I'm thinking of London pay. So I'm sure there are some very low starting salaries for kind of like assistant roles. It might be sort of like £25,000. But if you're taking on a kind of funeral arranger role, you're taking on a funeral director role, it's going to be probably in the sort of £25,000 to £35,000 bracket. And I think that's probably realistic for kind of lots of those roles.
Okay. Amazing. Thank you so much for all of that. I think that's just fascinating. And I mean, actually, I do genuinely, I'm quite tempted myself. I'd love to come in, actually. I'd love to spend a couple of hours in the mortuary, but Thank you so much for everything that you've shared.